My business partner didn't just betray me. He stole every major client we had and launched a new company using the exact same process that built our reputation. Within a week, people in our industry were already saying my career was finished. But the strange part was, I didn't panic, because the system he copied, the one he believed made the company successful, had one critical piece he never understood. And without that piece, everything he stole was about to collapse. My name is Adrian Cole, and for most of my career, I've worked behind the scenes. I'm what people in our industry call a process architect. I don't sell the big ideas. I don't stand in front of clients giving dramatic presentations. And I'm usually not the person shaking hands at conferences. My work happens quietly, in systems and structures that most people never notice. I design the processes that allow companies to run faster, cheaper, and more reliably than their competitors. 15 years ago, I started a small consulting firm from a cramped office above an old printing shop. Back then, I had almost nothing, no investors, no brand reputation, and only a handful of experimental ideas about how business operations could be improved. But I had one advantage that many companies ignored. I understood that most businesses don't fail because they lack clients. They fail because their internal systems are inefficient. So I spent years building something different. While other firms relied on traditional step-by-step project methods, I began designing a structured operational process that automated parts of the workflow and simplified the rest. Every stage of a project connected to the next through a carefully designed system. When it worked properly, the entire operation moved like a machine, predictable, efficient, and almost impossible to slow down. From the outside, the results looked simple. Projects finished faster. Costs dropped. Clients received consistent outcomes without the usual delays and confusion that most firms struggled with. But behind that simplicity was a complex system I had spent years refining. At first, the company grew slowly. Our early clients came through referrals and small contracts. But once people began noticing how efficient our projects were, word started spreading. Within a few years, our client list expanded faster than I had expected. That was around the time Victor Hayes entered the picture. Victor was everything I wasn't. Where I preferred quiet planning and careful structure, Victor thrived in conversations, negotiations, and presentations. He had an instinct for building relationships and convincing people to trust him. When he spoke to clients, he could make even the most complicated service sound exciting. At first, bringing him into the company felt like the perfect balance. Victor handled sales, networking, and client relationships while I focused on improving the operational system behind the business. To the outside world, Victor quickly became the public face of our company. Clients saw him at meetings, conferences, and contract signings. Meanwhile, I stayed in the background designing the process that actually made the business work. And for several years, that arrangement worked beautifully. Our client base expanded across multiple industries. Contracts grew larger. The company developed a reputation for being unusually efficient. Competitors often tried to imitate our results, but none of them could quite figure out how we were moving projects so quickly without sacrificing quality. Victor loved telling clients that we had cracked the formula for efficiency. What he didn't tell them was that the formula wasn't a slogan, it was a system. And that system existed almost entirely inside the operational structure I had designed. Over time, as the company became more successful, I started noticing something about Victor's behavior that hadn't been there before. At first, it was subtle small questions during meetings, casual curiosity about how certain internal steps worked, or requests for access to parts of the workflow he had never cared about previously. One afternoon after a client meeting, he asked me how the automation layer connected to our scheduling process. Another time he asked about the decision trees we used to route projects between departments. These weren't sales questions. They were technical ones. At the time, I assumed he simply wanted to understand the business more deeply. After all, partners should know how their company works. But the questions didn't stop. They became more detailed, more specific. Victor started asking how different components of the workflow interacted with each other. He wanted to see diagrams, system maps, and internal documentation that I had never needed to show him before. I answered most of his questions, but not all of them. Not because I didn't trust him, but because explaining the full system was complicated. The process wasn't just a checklist anyone could read. It was a structure that relied on timing, internal permissions, and a few key mechanisms that only existed inside the operational architecture I had built. From Victor's perspective, the business probably looked simple. Clients came in, projects moved through a process, and results came out the other side. But the reality was much different. What he was seeing was the outside of a machine. The inside the engine that made everything run smoothly was something I had spent more than a decade designing. At the time, I thought Victor's curiosity was harmless. Looking back now, I understand something I didn't see then. Victor wasn't asking those questions because he wanted to improve the company. He was studying the machine he believed he could eventually take. The betrayal didn't arrive as a dramatic confrontation. There was no shouting, no sudden argument, no moment where Victor openly declared what he was planning. Instead, it unfolded quietly, in a way that at first looked like ordinary business activity. The first sign was an email from one of our longtime clients. He asked a simple question that seemed strange at the time. He wanted to know whether our company was restructuring leadership. I assumed he had misunderstood something from a meeting with Victor, so I reassured him that nothing had changed. A few days later, another client called with a similar question. This time the wording was slightly different. He asked if Victor's new firm would still honor the contracts we had already signed. That was the moment something felt wrong. Victor had never mentioned starting another company. In fact, just a week earlier we had been discussing plans to expand our operations into 2 additional markets. The idea that he would launch a separate firm without telling me didn't make sense. So I did what anyone in my position would do. I started looking into it. Within an hour, I found the first piece of evidence. Victor had quietly registered a new company nearly 3 months earlier. The registration was public record. But the name was different enough that I had never connected it to him before. When I looked deeper, I discovered something that made the situation much clearer and much worse. Several of our largest clients had already signed agreements with that new company. At first, I couldn't understand how he had convinced them to move. Our firm had strong relationships with those clients, and most of them had worked with us for years. But the more I investigated, the more the picture began to form. Victor hadn't just started a competing business. He had been preparing it while still working beside me. For months, he had been quietly contacting our clients, explaining that he was the real strategist behind our company's success. He told them he was launching a new operation that would offer the same process, same efficiency, and the same results, only under his leadership. And because Victor had always been the person meeting them face to face, many of those clients believed him. Within a week, the situation escalated quickly. More contracts moved to his new company. Industry contacts started asking questions. Some people assumed the 2 of us had simply decided to separate the business into different divisions. Others believed a more dramatic story that Victor had left and taken the real system with him. Then came the public announcement. Victor revealed his new company during an industry networking event that several of our major clients attended. According to the people who were there, he spoke confidently about launching a new era of efficiency in our field. He even described the operational method that had made our company successful, presenting it as something he had helped develop. By the next morning, the news had spread through our professional network. Emails began arriving from colleagues, competitors, and even former employees. Most of them were polite, but the message behind them was clear. They assumed my company was about to collapse. From the outside, the situation looked simple. Victor had the client relationships. Victor had the industry visibility. Victor now claimed to have the same operational process that had built our reputation. To most people, it appeared that he had taken everything that mattered. A few employees resigned within days, believing they had better opportunities at Victor's new firm. Some clients stopped responding to our messages entirely. Even a few suppliers began asking whether our company would still be operating in the coming months. Anyone watching the situation from the outside would have concluded that Victor had executed a nearly perfect takeover. He had the clients. He had the momentum, and he had convinced the industry that the system behind our success now belonged to him. But what Victor didn't understand, what none of those clients understood, was that copying the surface of a business is very different from controlling the engine that makes it function. Because the operational process Victor believed he had taken wasn't just a set of instructions or documents stored on a company's server. It was a structured system with layers of internal controls, decision paths, and automated mechanisms that only work together in a very specific way. From the outside, It probably looked like something simple enough to replicate. But the truth was that the most important components of that system were never visible in the files Victor had access to. They existed in a place he had never thought to look. And without those components, the machine he believed he had stolen was about to behave very differently than he expected.